Okay, I'm going to start. Hello, everyone, and a very warm welcome to the London School of Economics and Political Science. My name is Susanna Moreno. I'm the Pro-Director for Research here at LSE and also a Professor of Environmental Economics. We're very happy to have you with us this afternoon in person, despite the tube strike and the slightly dodgy weather, and also all the people that are joining us on Zoom, which promises to be a fascinating lecture topic of too much information. The lecture is jointly hosted by the Department of Geography and Environment and the Department of Psychological and Behavioral Science. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome our speaker, Professor Cass Sunstein, and our discussant, Professor Peter John, to LSE. We are incredibly fortunate to have both of you with us today. And Cass, I know this is your second lecture of the day at LSE and your fourth lecture of the day overall, all on different topics. And I think there's still one to go after this. So thank you so much for your commitment and for making the time to be with us today. Let me start with an introduction. Professor Sunstein is the Robert Walmsley University Professor at Harvard. He has had an amazing career, which is way too long to do justice here. He's a famous legal scholar and also an expert in behavioral economics. He has held and holds many public positions of note, including in the White House, and he has written hundreds of articles and dozens of books, including influential texts on constitutional law, cost-benefit analysis, and famously on nudges, and also a wonderfully titled best-selling book on the world according to Star Wars, which I haven't read yet, but actually is on my list to read this summer. His recent book, Too Much Information, Understanding What You Don't Want to Know, is the topic for today's public lecture. Cass will speak for about 30 minutes, and then I will hand over to our discussant, Professor Peter John, for his reaction and his comments. Professor Peter John is the head of the School of Politics and Economics at King's College London and Professor of Public Policy. He's known for his work on public policy and behavioral intervention, including Nudge Plus. I'm lucky to have worked with him in the last few years. We jointly supervise a PhD student, Sunstein Banerjee, who helped actually organize today's event. As usual, there'll be a chance at the end for you to ask questions. And for those in the audience, please raise your hands and wait until the microphone reaches you. For those on Zoom, please use the Q&A facility on Zoom. Before asking a question, please do introduce yourselves with your name and your affiliation. This event is being recorded, so if we don't have any technical disasters, it will be available as a podcast afterwards. For those Twitter users in the audience, the hashtag for today is #LSE Sunstein. But now I'm delighted to hand over to Professor Cass Sunstein for the lecture. Over to you.
Thank you all. Hi everybody online. Hi to those of you whom I can actually see in person. And it's a complete thrill to be here. LSE, the work done here yesterday, the day before, 10 years ago, 50 years ago is a beacon for people all over the world. And to see you in person is an honor and a thrill. Dickens has I think, unbearably moving introduction to David Copperfield, in which he says that every parent has in his heart of hearts a favorite child, and of my various writings, there is one I love the most, and his name is David Copperfield. I am lucky that people are willing to hear 5 talks by me on this day, and while what you're about to hear isn't any David Copperfield, it is, I confess, my favorite, and it goes to some fundamentals, I think, as will be self-evident. So I have 2 epigraphs for you. The first was written about an hour from here at Eton, and one of the lines from Thomas Gray will be familiar. I hope you'll hear the lines as if they were new. Gray is looking at Etonians. There happen to be men, but at their energy and enthusiasm and verve. And he writes, thinking of what's coming to them eventually, to each his sufferings, all are men, condemned alike to groan, the tender for another's pain, the unfeeling for his own. Yet, why should they know their fate, since sorrow never comes too late and happiness too swiftly flies, thought would destroy their paradise. No more, where ignorance is bliss, 'tis folly to be wise. That's a plea for the welfare-enhancing effects of ignorance. The other epigraph is from the greatest novel in the English language, the greatest novel in any language. Don't argue. It's called Confession by A.S. Byatt. A salute to you, Ms. Byatt. If you're listening in any sense, you have written the greatest novel in the English language. And here's a passage in which a suitor, an imagined hero poet, is speaking to his beloved. And this is a letter of seduction. I cannot bear not to know the end of a tale. I will read the most trivial things once commenced, only out of a feverish greed to be able to swallow the ending, sweet or sour, and to be done without what I need never have embarked on. Are you in my case, or are you a more discriminating reader? Do you lay aside the unprofitable? That's quite a seductive letter, isn't it? And it's the opposite of ignorance is bliss. It's a plea for knowledge. I have two stories for you to accompany the epigraphs. When I worked in the White House a number of years ago, I worked on a regulation to call for calorie labels. You have them here, calorie labels. So you know how many calories are in your hamburger or your fish sandwich. And we had a debate in the White House about whether to include food at movie theaters within our calorie mandate rule. And I was of the view that we should. What you get at the movie theater could be fattening or not, and that people should have information about that. But I was outvoted. The consensus was we didn't really have the data and we shouldn't propose that. And so we didn't, but I argued, let's at least propose an alternative and ask for public comments and data. So maybe we can finalize the rule if the data comes in to include movie theaters. And as the data came in from the public comments, the consensus flipped and popcorns were, and movie theaters were indeed included in the calorie disclosure mandate. And I sent a celebratory note to a friend who sent me a note back with 3 words: Cass ruined popcorn. Those seemed to me at the time to be brilliant words, and we now actually have data suggesting that people with self-control problems despise the calorie labels and don't respond to them by eating more healthy food. So there's data suggesting that the intuition about ruining popcorn had truth in it. The second story, we're friends now, is going to be personal, and it's going to be connected like with life, not with government regulations. About 30 years ago, maybe a little more, my father, who was at the time in his 60s and extremely athletic and full of energy and fun, started to stumble on the tennis court. He was an avid tennis player. And my mother and I took him to the hospital for a battery of tests. And after the tests were completed, my mother talked to the doctor and came into the room where my father and I were having lunch and said with relief and delight, the results are in, you're completely fine, you have nothing to worry about. They're going to keep you here for a day or two for a few more things, but basically you're fine. And we had a celebratory lunch, after which my mother took me down to the parking lot to drive me back to law school. And I saw her like an actor flip instantly from joy and calm and ease to despair. It's the only time I've seen despair on a human face. And she said, I lied. The results of the test are devastating. Your father has a very advanced brain tumor. He's going to die in a year, maybe a little more, but you're not going to tell him that, and I'm not going to either. I don't know to this day whether she made the call, but I do know that she made a considered judgment, that she thought for my dad, the next months could be staring at a tombstone or not, and she didn't want him to be staring at a tombstone. And I think she made a call for herself also. She didn't want the two of them to be staring at a tombstone until they had to. So in the large, she didn't want popcorn to be ruined. When I worked in the government, we were engaged in a number of disclosure policy issues, fuel economy labels, GMO labels, calorie labels, energy efficiency labels, sunscreen labels, et cetera. And the amount of discipline given to the assessment of the benefit of the labels was less, let me put this lightly, than the amount of discipline that would be ideal to give to the question whether to put the labels on. People are deluged with information, sometimes voluntarily, sometimes by mandate, and the question of the welfare effects of information remains to be sorted out. Given that gap, I have embarked for the last 6 years or so on a reckless, exuberant empirical project, which has defined all over the world what people want to know and what they don't want to know. And I describe this as a reckless empirical project. This is a confession to all of you, because I didn't have a hypothesis. I was not testing a hypothesis. I just wanted to know what people want to know. So one example, I've asked people, like large numbers of people, like let's take it as close to a nationally representative survey in an English-speaking nation. Do you want to know whether the person for you whom you have romantic feelings reciprocates those feelings? The answer, 58%. That's interesting, not 90%. Why is it 58%? I did the same thing with Harvard students, by the way, a fairly large number, and 100% wanted to know whether the person for whom they had romantic feelings reciprocate. Is the 58% lower than at least I anticipated because people thought they'd get bad news and they didn't want that? Is it that the Harvard students are much more confident? Or is it that people in the nationally representative sample are kind of married and it would be dangerous? And the Harvard people are single and it wouldn't be dangerous. Okay, here are the kinds of answers I've gotten. And I should say that while I'm going to give you answers from the United States, this has been done in 17 nations, and the kinds of percentages are roughly the same across nations. This is humanity you're about to hear about, not about any particular culture. 43% of people want to know the calories in their food in the next year. 57% don't. That's puzzling in view of the fact that in most nations, 80% or more want the government to mandate disclosure of calories. Overwhelming support for calorie disclosure policies, only minority desire to get the calorie labels. The biggest loser in terms of all the questions I've asked is the same across nations. Do you want to know what year you're going to die? Strong majority of people don't want to know the year they're going to die. 27% of people only in the American sample want to know the year they're going to die, and that's roughly typical. The way this is demographically diverse, includes the young as well as the old, male as well as female, poor as well as rich, educated as well as not. And for most of these questions, I worked so hard with co-authors to try to find some characteristic that is predictive of answers. And as a first approximation, we failed. You want to know whether you're going to get Alzheimer's? 53% say, gosh, no. I think they actually said, God, no. You want to know whether you're going to get cancer? 58% say yes. You want to know what your friends and family really think of you? 42% say yes. Most don't want to know. That could be a dark mirror episode, yes, where you can get instant access. People don't want that. Do you want to know how much warmer the planet is going to be in 2100? 42% want to. Most don't. Do you want to know if your spouse or partner cheats on you? Only 57% want to know. A significant percentage don't. Do you want to know if there's actually a heaven? 53% say yes. Do you want to know if there's a hell? 44% say yes. Do you want to know the safety ratings for your tires? 67% say yes. That's a relatively big winner. Do you want to know the side effects of pain relievers? 65% say yes. Roughly with respect to disclosure that bears on economic and well-being, on health and safety, the percentage of people who want to know, it's rare that it's under 50%. I don't think there's any case where it's over 70%. Okay, so what we have is a potpourri of findings with a lot of heterogeneity. To get a little more discipline on this, in many nations, we've asked, how much do you want to pay to get the information, contingent on wanting to get it? How much would you pay not to get the information, contingent on not wanting to get it? Typically, people don't want to pay a whole lot to get it if they want it. Maybe 50 pounds a year, maybe 100 pounds a year. If they don't want to get it, they are willing to pay something not to get it, but it's not a lot. 5 to 15 pounds not to what you're going to die in, and less than that for calorie labels if people don't want to get calorie labels, which is to suggest that contingent on wanting things, people kind of want them, not hugely, but yes. Contingent on not wanting things, people aren't going to pay a lot to be told, but they will pay something. Okay, here's the puzzle. Let's call this the ex post puzzle. What's going on in this unruly data? We've now done a lot of work, both conceptual and empirical, and we have a bit of a purchase on what's happening. People are making a rough and ready assessment of three things. The first is the instrumental value of the information. The second is the hedonic value of the information. And the third, let's call it the cognitive value of the information. Instrumental first. Some people think if I know the calories in my food, I can be healthier, and hooray for that. Some people think if I know the calories in the food, it won't affect my choices at all, and boo, and so I don't care. And some people think if I know the calories in my food, I'm going to start eating a lot of salad and not much in the way of brownies, and that's bad because I like brownies and not so much salad. So people are making a calculation about whether the instrumental value is positive or negative or neutral. And the most interesting category is the negative. A lot of, well, a little story for you, shall I tell you? On a very exciting day a few years ago, all the course evaluations came out at Harvard, and all the faculty, we could see if the students liked our courses. So I went up with excitement to a colleague and said, our evaluations are out. It's kind of pathetic, but I was excited about it. And he looked at me and he said, I haven't read them in 20 years. And I said, why don't you read them? He said, they're no use to me. They're not going to affect my teaching. I teach the way I teach. And they might even make me a little mad at my students, and I'll teach worse. So they would have a negative effect. People might not want to know if they're lawyers, whether their client is guilty, and therefore it would have a negative instrumental value. Okay, the second feature of people's calculus, the hedonic, I think is the most interesting. Some people think if I get the calorie label, I'm just going to be sad and a little scared, and that's going to drive my judgment. If I get the calorie label, others will think it won't bug me at all, and I'll be a little excited to be able to use that information. People want to know when they're going to die because they think it's just going to upset them terribly. And the numbers you see for Alzheimer's and cancer are correspondingly reflective of the emotional impact. So people are making a rapid assessment of whether this is going to cause delight or misery or fear or calm. And there's heterogeneity on this that cuts across persons in interesting ways. My guess is that each of you has a quick, intuitive judgment, which is pretty accurate, of whether you're an information seeker or an information avoider, and that might be relatively robust across domains, and it might be driven mostly by hedonic impact. And the data is consistent with that sense that people can be sorted as information seekers or avoiders in a way that is related to hedonic impact. With cognitive value, this is the only three that's elusive, where some people just want to know things or don't care whether to know things, not because it would affect what they do and not because it would affect how they feel, but because they want to know. Either because it fits into a mental map in a way that they find intriguing or valuable, or because they have, let's call curiosity a black box, but it's a good black box for this purpose. And the way I got clearer in my own head on this somewhat elusive idea is with a co-author. I asked her, don't you want to know the relationship between wolves and dogs? How many of you want to know that? That's great. About 40% wants to know that. I find that like the most interesting question in the world. And my co-author found that completely and uninteresting. Neither of us would benefit hedonically or instrumentally by knowing the answer to that question. But one, yours truly, cares. She, my co-author, didn't care. So that plays a role. So the basic thought is that people make a rough and ready assessment of cognitive value, instrumental value, and hedonic value, and that maps on to their choices, and that explains the data. What we have to add to this is that this rational picture of information seeking or an information avoidance outruns reality. We can make predictions assuming rationality, but we will bracket the fact that people show present bias, which might lead them to avoid or not to seek information in circumstances in which it's really important to get it. So people might not want to go to the doctor or not get their course evaluations or not pick up their grades. Yes, new people like that? Even though the instrumental value is significant because the short-term hedonic value is low. Present bias to boundedly rational judgments about information seeking and information avoidance. We know also that people tend to be unrealistically optimistic, where approximately 90% of people believe they're safer than the average driver. 94% of professors believe they're better than the average professor. And 100% of people believe their sense of humor is better than that of the average person. That's because they know what's funny. And optimistic bias can lead to, let's say, insufficient information seeking in circumstances in which information seeking can prevent of trouble. The most interesting behavioral qualification to a rational account of information seeking and information avoidance involves adaptation. So if people get not good health news, they anticipate a much longer term adverse emotional impact than bad health news typically produces. So if people learn there's something wrong, it's a rocky day, but it's often not a rocky 2 months, and people underestimate their capacity to adapt to the bad news. Does that resonate? Okay, so if we put present bias together with unrealistic optimism and let's say adaptation neglect, we might call it, we might see puzzles of insufficient and excessive information seeking and mirror image in the form of information avoidance. In fact, we can speculatively, but not in this case recklessly, map what we know about information seeking and information avoidance into mental health issues. And there's reason to think it's a plausible hypothesis to think that some mental health problems are characterized by anomalies with respect to information seeking and information avoidance. And while a great deal remains to be done on this, let's say that it's a plausible hypothesis that people who are depressed engage in a lot of information avoidance, and people who suffer from anxiety disorders engage in a lot of information seeking. And but both of these can compound the underlying condition, creating not excellent spirals. Okay, I'm going to give you a little data now that involves an experiment involving the artist formerly known as Facebook, Meta. And here's the data, and I'm just going to give you the data flat, and then we're going to talk about information seeking and information avoidance. The data takes a very large population and asks how much would you have to be paid to be off Facebook for a month? And let's suppose there's a chunk of the population that's 100 pounds. Let's say there's a large N. Okay, you take that large number and you cut it in half and you say to one half, sorry, no deal. You're not going to be off Facebook, but we're going to ask you a bunch of questions over the next month if you're willing to answer. And then the other half, we say, hooray, you're getting the 100 pounds and you have to spend the month off Facebook. What the experiment is designed to do is to measure the well-being effects of being off Facebook. And here's the basic finding, that with respect to every possible measure of well-being, the people who were off Facebook for a month had better lives. So they both got 100 pounds, plus they were more satisfied with their lives, they were happier, they were less anxious, they were depressed. Everything the experimenters threw at them produced a better month for those people. And then they were asked after the month, now how much would you have to be paid to be off Facebook for another month? The answer, the average answer, 83 pounds. It's a little bit crazy, isn't it? The reason it's a little bit crazy, not in the technical sense, is that they had a good month. They should have said, we'll pay you. And yet they demanded that number. Okay, how should we think of it? Let's imagine the data doesn't give us an answer. Here are two hypotheses. One is that the people who said 83 pounds were thinking, I want the information that I get by virtue of being on Facebook because it has instrumental value, even if it isn't going to make me happier, and indeed, even if I'm going to take a hedonic hit. So people might say, I learned stuff that doesn't make me smile or delighted, but that does make me informed about the world. And indeed, the one measure on which people who are off Facebook for the month do less well than the people who stayed on, people who are off had less political knowledge. So they might have been saying, and we need to do more about the data, that the instrumental value outweighs the hedonic hit, or the cognitive value combined with the instrumental outweighs the hedonic hit. The alternative hypothesis is that the people who demanded almost as much money to be off for another month were making a hedonic forecasting error, that they didn't get the significant hedonic benefits of being off Facebook. Okay, I'm going to say something now. I expected this to be a policy talk. Okay, here's a little bit on policy. There are some policy implications that involve both whether to require the disclosure of information and that involve how to do it. So call the first the question up or down, and the second the prescriptive question, how to do it exactly. The policy question, I think, has a bright spotlight on the welfare question. that I didn't see adequately when I was in the Obama administration. That if you're disclosing information about calories or about fuel economy or about anything health related, to take on board the full set of welfare effects, not just the economic health effects, is a really good thing to do. And if there's a welfare minus because people are made sad and scared, that it is humane and respectful to consider as part of the overall assessment. If people are distressed, if they are terrified, if they are going to do the same thing but with less pleasure in life, that's a welfare negative. And we need to be much more organized about considering the full assortment of negative and positive effects of giving information. One upshot would be that there might be a lot of heterogeneity out there. In fact, it seems so, which suggests personalized information disclosure has a little more charm than it otherwise have, where some people want it and others don't. And to honor that is probably a presumptively good thing, except if there is some behavioral bias or mistake. So think of information as in some sense a commodity, and to provide information to people who say, that's terrible, I don't want that, is not going to make their lives better, unless there's something in the situation. Prescriptively, and I think there's a world of work to be done on this, there are ways of disclosing information that maximize the instrumental value and minimize the negative hedonic impact or not. And we can disclose information in a way that makes people feel upbeat and stronger and more secure, or we can provide information in a way that makes people feel powerless and at sea. To provide information prescriptively in a way that spotlights the instrumental and hedonic effects might be to lead toward paths that will make relevant populations find the information more useful and find it empowering rather than the opposite. Okay, one last notation. And do you know Frank Ramsey? Do you know that name, Frank Ramsey? Okay, Frank Ramsey, who was at Cambridge, died at the age of 26. Keynes thought he was maybe a better economist than Keynes. Russell thought he was maybe a better philosopher than Russell. Wittgenstein, who was very disagreeable, thought he was in Wittgenstein's league as a philosopher, and in math, but his real field was math. So this is really an extraordinary, believable person. He died at the age of 26. When he was in his 20s, he was in a battle with Wittgenstein on facts and truth, where Wittgenstein in the Tractatus had written that, philosophy kind of runs out with respect to facts. So if there's not a fact of the matter, then philosophy has nothing to say. And Frank Ramsey, 20-something, spoke in front of the apostles, as they were called at Cambridge, the greatest collection of thinkers, as they say, since Thomas Jefferson, except for when Jefferson died alone. That's an Americanism. This was even greater than Jefferson dying alone. And in Ramsey's talk, he said, he went at Wittgenstein, he went at him hard. He said, I find the world a pleasant and exciting place. You find you don't, and you despise me. I pity you. And there's no making a resolution of the argument dependent on a fact. There is no fact of the matter. I find it this way, you find it that way. But it is better to be thrilled than to be depressed. And not only better in itself, but better for all of life's activities, said Ramsey something, 20-something Ramsey. My suggestion is we should take that on board in thinking about disclosure of information. Thanks.
Cass, I'd like to say thank you for such a great, entertaining and insightful talk. And in the talk and in your book, in fact, you didn't plug your book, so I'm going to plug it for you. He asked the right questions about whether there's too much information today, whether the right information is being received by citizens in a meaningful way, and whether there be ways of doing things differently. And in reading your book, I've been reflecting that I'm a sort of university manager, head of schools. So one of the things I do is oversee the provision of lots of information. And I think there's a fair few students. I'm over the road, by the way, at King's College, but students, Eric, even between LSE and King's. So we produce huge amounts of information on websites. But we know as university tutors that the first questions you get asked are a whole set of factual questions, which the obvious answer is actually on a website, and a lot of people don't know all the information. In fact, even some of the tutors, I guess, probably don't know all the information. And then sometimes what happens is by sometimes that failure to absorb that information or not to focus on some really, because a lot of the information isn't massively useful, and a lot of it can be generalized to common sense or universities kind of protecting themselves. But there are one or two little bits of information really, really important. And so if you get them really wrong, like the plagiarism rules, then you can find yourself much worse off. And I think I think the part of the big question is, what do we do as a kind of policy question, for university teachers, for administrators like myself? And I think what we do is we kind of signal to the individual that certain bits of information are really important. Hey, you take note. And I seem to remember doing that, in lectures, that you kind of talk about the regs of the course, but you say, hang on a sec, there's this one rule here that you really ought to pay attention to. And I think that is really about the secret, I think, of getting that kind of dialogue right, I think. And I think moving on to the kind of key issue of avoiding listening to information you don't want to hear, I think we need to sort of address a little bit the ethical issue of administrators or policymakers seeking to sort of, in a sense, override somebody's kind of preferences, not to want to listen to information, either using sort of nudge techniques or making information more kind of attractive. And I suppose the proposal which I've got to sort of address this issue, and I think it's one which can actually speak to, the sense, how can individuals have some kind of ownership of information they really want to see. And I think my solution is that people could be prompted to think about the information, about what's important to them, as well as the information being delivered to it. And I think in a sense, that's kind of what, Peter John as teacher is doing when he says, either way, pay attention to this. It's actually having that kind of dialogue. And myself and Sunstein Banerjee, who's organized this conference, are working on a program of research we call Nudge Plus, is that you can sort of deliver a nudge, a prompt, a piece of information, but at the same time, you also have that kind of willingness to engage in a kind of conversation. And that kind of keeps the kind of partnership. Because in a sense, if governments are really trying to seek to, in a sense, override your initial preferences, that's not necessarily a good way forward. We have to have citizens who are on board with ways to reform the presentation of that information. So that's all I've got to say. I know you've got lots and lots of questions. Great talk, Cass, and look forward to further discussions.
Thank you so much, Cass and Peter, for thought-provoking talk. I will now open the floor to questions. I'll ask questions in groups of 3, first from the audience here, then from the online audience. So if you want to ask a question, please could you raise your hand and then wait until the microphone goes to you. And please introduce yourselves with your name and affiliation. Lady there in the middle, with the glasses first.
Thank you so much for the one talk. Sorry for my throat. I think I'm Kangan. I'm doing behavioral science from LSE. My question is around the algorithm aversion literature. And they say that you have to be more transparent for people to go and use algorithms. But here it clearly visible that people don't want that information. So if you make it transparent, then again, they don't need that information. So how do you see that? Like, is it something which is also applicable in the algorithm aversion literature, when people do not trust algorithm because it's not transparent and they still don't need information? So what do you think about it? Thank you so much.
I defer to you.
Okay, so at the back, please.
Thank you very much. Sibs Anwar, from a doctor at the Barts Heart Centre in Cleveland Clinic, London. My question is along the lines of cast ruin popcorn. In this country, we're transitioning from compulsory labelling for food products on the shelves, which arguably is a non-discretionary instrumental piece of information, to compulsory labelling on restaurants. So the argument is for hedonic information, for an indulgent experience, are we ruining fine dining?
And the final question here at the front.
Hi, thank you. I'm Mariam, also doing the Master's in Behavioral Science at LSE. And my question is surrounding pro-environmental action, and you kind of touched upon it. Like, climate change is something that's going to affect us in the future, but we kind of don't want to hear the information about it because we're probably scared. So I was wondering how information overload kind of hinders pro-environmental action. What can we do about it to like overcome this numbers that's going to probably happen with all the information or negative information surrounding us?
These are such great questions. Thank you. So can I tell you a climate change experiment? So we'll go at data. Here's the experiment. We take a population, a big population, and ask them how much warming they think there's going to be. And so we have 3 terciles, call them strong climate change believers, weak climate change believers, and moderate climate change believers. And then you take, you slice them in half, and you give half information suggesting that it's going to get really hot, really much hotter than you think. Now, what do you think? And then you take the other half and you give them information suggesting it's not going to get that hot. It's actually not that bad. Ask them what you think. I can tell you the answer. The strong climate change believers update much more in response to the alarming information than in response to the comforting information. So this isn't about information seeking, it's about updating, but it's related to information seeking. So the top tercile think the, oh my gosh, alarming news is credible, and think the calm down now, it's not so bad is not credible. For the weak climate change believers, these aren't denial people. These are people who believe it's not that bad. If they hear it's really scary, they change not at all. They are completely unresponsive to that news. They dismiss it. If they hear it's going to be better even than they thought, they adjust. So what we're observing is asymmetrical updating, and the information, by the way, in the experiment is credible. It comes from scientists. Asymmetrical updating of an asymmetrical kind, where the strong believers update asymmetrically, meaning alarming, yes, I agree. Comforting, no, that's stupid. That probably was paid for. And the weak believers think scary information, that's environmental crazy people. Comforting information, that's credible. This bears on information seeking and avoidance too, doesn't it? It's about the ironic, I think, where the climate change, the really scared people are keenly interested in the issue typically, and will seek out the information, and the not scared people just the opposite. That's a real problem for those of us who are concerned with climate change. But it's also a signal about what to do. If you throw at people information that makes them feel powerless and scared and humiliated, they might throw you out of the room. But there's a way of giving the information to them in a way that gives them agency, connected with Peter's comment. And we can talk what look like, but that would, you see why I'm so excited about this, by the way, that it bears on not only daily life, but policy issues. Okay, so that was very compressed what I said, but at least I had data. For the other two, I lack data. For transparency, give people transparency about what they're supposed to do if they have heart disease. That's probably a really great thing. And if you give them information that's all confusing and baffling, that's probably sadistic or clueless. Give people information that's transparent about something that they don't care about. Like, I can give you information about how much hair is on the head of the median person in 193 countries in the world. You don't want to know that. Why would you want to know that? And so transparency is great if people are either interested or potentially interested in it. It's basically neither here nor there if people don't care because it has no instrumental value or because it just makes them feel frightened or miserable. So whether transparency is going to work or be effective depends on their relationship to the thing. For compulsory labeling, compulsory labeling at restaurants, I loved how you phrased it because I thought, I'm not sure what kind of labeling we're talking about. If the compulsory labeling tells you at the restaurant exactly how many electrons are in each piece of fish, well, maybe some of you would want to know that. A lot of electrons is my guess. Electrons are small, right? Really small. But if it's labeling, such data as we have is on balance supportive of the claim that this has positive welfare effects. But that's a contingent truth. It's not a necessary truth. So if it makes people healthier and it doesn't make them hate their meals, then it's probably a good idea. And that's what the data is suggestive of. But we could imagine a population where it went the other way.
Thank you very much. I'll ask three of the online questions that are here. The first one is from Matt Campbell from Canada. With the public reluctance to know certain facts, risks, and likelihoods of events that you described, do you think this justifies a slightly more paternalistic approach from government? Then a question from Annabelle Gillard. Could you comment on whether the profusion of information has had an effect on the concept of post-truth or post-fact world? And finally, we have a question here from, I missed this one. Could you comment on, that's from Annabelle Gillard, could you comment on the social and ethical implications of moving to a tailored selective information world rather than a collective share of the same information?
These are fantastic questions. Okay, so if people are reluctant to know facts, do we have an argument for paternalism? Let's take two categories. First, people are reluctant to know facts that bear on their own well-being, but they don't know. Second, cases where people are reluctant to know facts that would reduce the likelihood they would do harm to others. That's different. So let's say first, I'm looking at Adam Oliver here. I think you'll find this congenial, that the case of providing people with information so they don't harm others has a more obvious justification than providing people with information that they are screaming not to get. Okay, so we have some of the scientists here told me as I was preparing for this talk, they have an algorithm and they know with high confidence what year each of us is going to die. You want to know? I made that up. There is no such algorithm, but it wouldn't be a very nice thing to be paternalistic and to force that in people's heads when they don't want to know it. So I avoid paternalism. with respect to, let's say, reflective reluctance to know facts. But if people's reluctance to know facts depends on present bias, let's say, or an exaggerated sense of their inability to adapt because they're really terrified to hear the throat, then maybe a little paternalism's okay. Forgive me, anti-paternalist friends. On post-truth and post-fact, whether we live in a post-truth or post-fact world, I hope not. So I don't think we do. We do have challenges with respect to truth and fact, and the profusion of information, ironically, I think we want to call it the profusion of information, much of which is false, is a contributor to that. The social and ethical issues, this was a great question of what finished the end of the sentence? I had it, but lost it. And I hope it's not because I didn't want to know.
Yeah, let me just find it again.
Oh, yes, I have it. It's a personalized, selective.
Yeah.
I think so. Here are three things noticeable. If people talk approvingly of algorithms, a room gets sadder and colder. If people talk about cost-benefit analysis as a solution to what ails us, there isn't a lot of brightness group. And if people talk about selective or personalized information disclosure, it's a little like talking about algorithms. Yes, people don't, that doesn't make you want to stand up and applaud, yes? And I think it's the ethical instinct, which is a pretty good heuristic, that in a large population, why should some people get information and not others? Might it be that the people who aren't getting it would benefit from it? And it might be that some people are empowered and other people aren't. And why is that a good thing to do? And all of these are good concerns. But I'll give a little data, shall I? I'm in a pro-data mood today, evidently. I don't know if you've gotten home energy reports. I do, where they tell you the information about how much energy you use and how it compares to that of your neighbors. There's data suggesting that some people really like them and would actually pay more for them than their economic value. Some people don't care, and some people would pay not to receive them. They hate those. I'm avoiding a vulgarity here. They hate those blanking home energy reports. Darning. Darning. That isn't even a word. They hate those home energy reports. Is it unethical to provide home energy reports to the people who want them and not to send them to the people who don't want them? I don't think so. At least if the goal of the home energy report is to help people save money, and if people save $3 or £3 a year, but it's not worth the trouble, I don't want to have to deal with that. I don't even want to have to look at it. Now, if there's an externality issue, then we're into the other category. But I mean, we all are seeking and not seeking information every moment. So personalized information seeking and avoidance is built into today. So it's okay.
Thank you. I think we have time for 3 more. So man at the back with the green shirt first, and then we. Yeah.
Hi. Yeah, I'm Matthew. I do philosophy and public policy. I was wondering if you think we should be sensitive to people's preferences if the information carries implicit normative judgments, such as, for example, like how many of your political opinions are based on lies, or how many animals were tortured to sustain your annual diet.
And then the woman after that.
Hi, Chiara, fourth-year PhD student in environmental economics. Thank you for your talk. It was very interesting. You mentioned the ethical limitations to information provision, but I was wondering if there are other limits to what we want to personalize or not personalize in what we tell people. First of all, because you mentioned people are really present biased. And so some of the things that we learn at school, the average student would not want to learn, but they turn out to be pretty useful later on. And we don't quite realize as we're doing calculus that we might need it, or as we're studying Greek, that maybe those letters are helpful. but also because as we personalize information, we're really changing the networks in which people operate. We're really telling people that suddenly there's different messages and they may not understand each other. And it seems very risky to me to create that type of society where there's no communication possible.
And final question. Yeah.
Hello, my name is James, and I'm a visitor to the LSE. Thank you for a wonderful talk. I have a very basic question. If we know that we are information avoiders and we know that's bad, why do we continue to avoid things? The same applies to information seekers, or to the Facebook example, or the colorist example. Then a follow-up to that. If we were to stop being what we are, meaning seekers or avoiders, wouldn't we live in a much better world? Simplify the entire problem.
Can you dig a little bit? I didn't quite hear.
Of course. So if we were to do exactly the opposite of what we are, so let's say I'm an information avoider, if I were to become an information seeker, wouldn't I solve the problem that I basically face that you just talked about?
Okay. These are also fantastic questions. I'm thinking in response to the question on personalization, that there's a lot to be done, like a ton to be done. And I'm hoping some people in the room will do it on personalized information provision. And it's not only a theoretically interesting question from philosophy and ethics and economics and psychology, it's also an intensely important practical question. And it's both science fiction that's about to happen and lived reality now, where each of us is avoiding every week information that people who are sitting next to you are seeking. Maybe because you're curious, maybe because you find it fun. I really want to know about what's going to happen with Star Wars over the next years. And I don't think I seek, is it pathetic to say I try to find out? But not all of you are, well, all of you are, right? You're keenly interested, like, and Obi-Wan Kenobi, I've seen the first 3 episodes. What's going to happen on the 4th episode? You're looking at me like you have no interest. And that suggests that at least in some domains, you're concerned about networks that are divergent in their knowledge and their interests. It's sometimes a horrible scenario and it's sometimes okay. Like with Star Wars, it's okay, I think. We shouldn't mandate non-personalized Star Wars information streams. But you're quite right with respect to some things involving health and the environment. Maybe it's a problem, and especially in the case of externality. Love the question about sensitivity to information where it has negative hedonic effects. So suppose it's the case that if you learn about the animal suffering in your food, you're going to feel terrible. Peter Singer has made a lot of people feel terrible by drawing attention to that. Is that a bad act? I think his answer is no, because there's a harm from the underlying conduct, and the net welfare benefits of knowledge of the harm exceed are positive. So I'd take this in a kind of blockheadedly welfarist direction and think what makes life better, not limited to human life, animal life. So if people learn about the suffering of human beings in the production of something, if that reduces that suffering, that's okay. By the way, we have data on this kind of thing, and it's a lot like the data I described, heterogeneity among people who want to know about whether the cell phone they bought is based on the movie with, is it based on, was it financed by mass atrocities? And there's heterogeneity there, but maybe this is one where we go for it, not for paternalistic reasons, but to reduce the externalities. On information avoiders becoming information seekers, that's really interesting. And I'm thinking if information avoiders are encouraged or nudge plussed or something to becoming information seekers, do we solve a problem? Now, the first cut is no, because the information avoiders are rational information avoiders. People don't want to know, a lot of them, if they're going to get Alzheimer's. And at first, that's okay. Maybe it'll throw them terribly, and they know this about themselves. But some of the questions, including yours, points to the problem of the problem or the phenomenon of preference endogeneity. So whether you want to get information about something is endogenous to multiple things, and it might be that you learn to become an information seeker is great, even though you were kind of scared at first. This is relevant to learning calculus, where it might be that a liberal society, liberal in the sense of liberal tradition, errs on the side of information provision on the ground that it promotes agency on the part of people, and that's a good thing to do.
Thank you so much. I think we've come to the end of the event. Unfortunately, it's been a great pleasure to have the opportunity to listen to Cass and to Peter on this fascinating topic of information and its effects on our well-being. Thank you both very much for coming today, and thank you, Cass, for making the time on your busy schedule to